Blood and Redemption, Episode 3. The days following the final confrontation were quieter, yet filled with an unsettling stillness. The crew had won, but the fight was far from over. Freedom wasn't something you simply achieved. It was something you had to maintain, day by day, moment by moment. The streets had tried to claim them once again, but this time, the crew had shown that they were more than just survivors. They had faced their demons, fought for something better, and won. But now they had to rebuild their lives from the ground up. They had learned the hard way that you couldn't just walk away from the streets and expect everything to be okay. The wounds they carried were deep, and no amount of victory could erase them. The question was, what now? The crew found themselves at a crossroads. They had broken free from the life they knew, but now they had to learn how to live outside of it. They had to find a way to make their mark without resorting to the violence and chaos they had once thrived on. King 2 had always been driven by anger, by revenge, by the need to settle the score. He had thought that vengeance would give him peace, but now he realized it had only kept him trapped. His brother's death, the years of fighting and bloodshed, it had been a cycle of pain that had no end. But with that final fight behind him, he found himself at a loss. He had never known a life without the streets. It had been his identity, his only source of power and respect. But now, as he sat alone in the dim light of their safe house, staring out at the city that had once been his battleground, he realized that he didn't know who he was without it. He had been defined by the chaos, the violence, the never-ending struggle to survive. But maybe, just maybe, it was time to redefine himself. Cori had always been the steady one, the one who held them together. He had seen them through their darkest moments, and now, as the crew adjusted to their new reality, he could sense that the real fight was only beginning. Freedom wasn't just about escaping the streets. It was about building something that could stand on its own, something that wouldn't collapse under the weight of their past mistakes. But as much as he tried to remain hopeful, he couldn't shake the feeling that the price of their freedom was higher than they realized. Sitting across from DG Mula, Cori could see the same doubt in his eyes that he felt in his own heart. They had won, but the victory was bittersweet. There was a long road ahead of them, and they weren't sure if they were ready to walk it. But if they didn't, the streets would pull them back in. "We can't run forever," Cori said softly, his voice filled with a quiet strength. "We've made it out, but the hardest part is what comes next." "I know," DG Mula replied, his voice just as quiet, but with an edge of determination. "We've come too far to give up now. The streets don't own us anymore, and I'm not going back." Snoob, who had always kept his cards close to his chest, found himself more conflicted than he had ever been. He had lived through countless battles, seen too many people fall, and lost too much of himself to the game. He had tried to leave it behind, but even now he couldn't shake the temptation to return. The streets had been his home for so long. The power, the respect, it had been intoxicating. Now, as he watched his crew struggle, he realized how much of himself he had left behind in that life. The problem was, he didn't know if he could fully let it go. But Snoobs wasn't stupid. He knew that the past couldn't be erased. The question wasn't whether they could escape it. It was whether they could build something better. "We can't keep living like this," Snoobs said one evening as the crew gathered to discuss their next move. "We've got to build something that lasts. But we can't do it without a plan." "Exactly," Cori said, meeting his gaze. "We need to think long-term. We need to figure out how we're going to survive in a world that doesn't care about redemption." Tuda had always been the quiet one, but even he could feel the weight of the situation. They had managed to break free from the cycle of violence, but now they were left with the task of rebuilding their lives from scratch. Tuda had been working on a plan for a legitimate business venture for a while, hoping to build something that wasn't tainted by their past. He knew it wasn't going to be easy. Leaving the streets behind was one thing, but making a living without the game was a whole other challenge. "You've got to start somewhere," Tuda said, his voice calm but filled with determination. "It's not going to be easy, but if we keep our heads down and stay focused, we can make it work." "I agree," No Party said, leaning back in his chair, his arms folded. "We can't keep running. We've got to face our past, but we can't let it control us. We've got to take that first step and keep going, no matter how hard it gets. But even as they spoke about building a future, there was a part of them that feared the unknown. They had all been shaped by the streets, and now they had to figure out how to survive without them. Forrest, always the quiet observer, sat back, watching the crew. He had seen them all at their lowest, and now, as they sat together trying to rebuild their lives, he could see the cracks in their outlook. They had been through so much, and it wasn't clear if they were ready to move forward. But there was one thing Forrest knew for sure. They couldn't keep running. The past would always be a part of them, but if they didn't face it head on, they would never truly be free. "We've all got ghosts," Forrest said, his voice steady, but carrying an underlying tone of wisdom. "But the only way to put them to rest is to live the life we're fighting for. The streets can't control us anymore, not unless we let them." The next few weeks were filled with planning, second-guessing, and moments of doubt. The crew had made their decision to walk away from the streets, but now they had to figure out what came next. They were trying to build something that didn't just survive, but thrived, a future that was worth fighting for. Each member of the crew had their role to play. Some worked on the logistics, figuring out how to set up a legitimate business. Others focused on maintaining the delicate balance of staying out of sight while keeping their resources intact. And all the while, they were still facing the ghosts of their past, the people who had once been their enemies, the choices they had made that had led them here. But one thing was clear. They were no longer running. They had made their choice to build a future, and now they had to make it happen. There was no turning back. The days after their decision were long and filled with hard work. They had broken free from the chains that the streets had wrapped around them for so long, but now came the real challenge, building a life that was completely different. The world they had tried to escape had shaped them, molded them into what they were. But now they had to reshape themselves, and that wasn't easy. King Tu found himself at odds with the change. He had always believed that strength came from power, the ability to control, to dominate. The streets had given him that. He had been at the top of the food chain, respected by those who feared him. But now, as he tried to navigate a world that didn't run on the same rules, he was struggling to understand where he fit in. Every time he found himself slipping back into old habits, getting angry, lashing out, wanting to make people pay, he had to remind himself that the world had changed. His anger was no longer his weapon, and revenge wasn't the solution. He had spent years fighting a battle that had no real end. Now, for the first time, he had to fight for something new, a life that didn't revolve around fear and violence. Sitting alone in the dim light of his room, King Tu clenched his fists. The weight of his past was suffocating. His brother's death still haunted him, and the feeling that he had to make someone pay for it gnawed at him. But slowly, he began to realize that fighting the past only dragged him deeper into it. He had to let go. "Maybe it's time I really let go," he muttered to himself, looking out the window at the city that had both built and broken him. He wasn't sure if he could fully let go yet, but the thought lingered. Maybe it was time to fight for something new, for his future. The crew slowly began to pull together the pieces of their new life. Every day was a challenge, every decision a reminder of the work that lay ahead. But as time passed, they began to find their rhythm. They learned how to navigate a world without the streets, how to move forward in a life where survival wasn't the only priority. They didn't have all the answers. They didn't have the perfect plan. But they had each other, and that was enough for now. As the sun set over the city that had once been their battleground, the crew stood together, united by their past but driven by the hope of their future. They had broken the cycle. Now it was up to them to rebuild. The crew had walked away from the game. They had broken free from the cycle of violence, revenge, and survival. But breaking free didn't mean escaping the consequences of their past. With each passing day, the reality of building a new life set in. They had dreams, hopes, and plans for a future they had never thought possible, but dreams alone wouldn't keep the darkness of their past at bay. King Tu was restless. He had spent his entire life fighting, and now that there was no one to fight, he didn't know what to do with himself. The streets had always given him purpose, a reason to keep moving. But now that he was out, he was forced to confront the emptiness inside of him. Without the constant need for survival, without the rage that had kept him going, King 2 was left to wonder who he was. One night, as he walked through the quiet streets, he found himself standing in front of a rundown building, one that used to be his territory. It had once been a symbol of his control, a place where he made decisions, called the shots. Now, it was just another abandoned shell of what used to be. The emptiness around him mirrored the emptiness he felt inside. "How do I keep going?" he whispered to the night, as though the city itself might have the answer. Cori's words echoed in his mind. "You are more than what the streets made you." But for the first time, he wondered if that was really true. Could he let go of the anger? Could he build something lasting, something worth fighting for? Or was he doomed to always be chasing ghosts? Snoobs sat across the table from Tuda, both of them looking over the plans they had put together for their new business venture. It was something they had worked hard for, a way to make money without resorting to the streets. But even as they made progress, Snoobs couldn't shake the feeling that something was missing. He'd learned to trust Tuda over the years, but now, as they worked towards something legitimate, the strain of the past seemed to hang over everything they did. The uncertainty of their new life was enough to make him restless. The idea of starting from scratch wasn't as easy as it seemed. "You sure this is the right move?" Snoobs asked, his voice tinged with doubt. Tuda paused for a moment, his eyes scanning the papers in front of him. "It's the only move we've got. We can't keep looking back. We have to keep pushing forward." But Snoobs wasn't convinced. He had seen too much to believe that escaping the past was as simple as making new plans. The streets had a way of pulling people back in, no matter how hard they tried to escape. "We'll keep pushing forward," Tuda added, more firmly this time. "But we have to believe in it. We have to trust that this is the path that's going to give us the freedom we're fighting for." Snoobs nodded slowly. He wasn't sure, but one thing was clear. They couldn't keep looking back. They had to keep moving forward, even if the road ahead was uncertain. Cori had always been the anchor, the voice of reason, the one who kept the crew grounded. But now he found himself struggling to keep everything together. The weight of his past decisions was heavier than he had expected. Every move they made felt like it could all come crashing down. There were too many uncertainties, too many threats from the past waiting in the shadows. Sitting alone in his room one night, Cori felt the full weight of what they had chosen. Breaking free from the streets hadn't come with the peace and freedom they had expected. Instead, it had come with more questions, more doubts. He had spent so long carrying the responsibility of the crew, keeping them together, keeping them safe. Now, he wasn't sure who was keeping him together. For the first time in a long while, Cori let himself feel the exhaustion of it all. He had spent so much energy trying to make sure everyone else was okay that he hadn't taken the time to check in with himself. "I can't do this alone," he whispered to the empty room. "I can't be the only one holding everything together." But Cori knew he wasn't alone. The crew was with him, even when it felt like the weight of the world was on his shoulders. He just needed to trust that they could all carry their share of the load. Forrest had always been the quiet observer, watching the others as they made their way through the new life they were trying to build. But even the quiet observer couldn't ignore the cracks that were beginning to show. It wasn't that the crew was falling apart. It was that they were still fighting their pasts, still struggling to let go of the lives they had once led. And even if they couldn't see it, Forrest could. The hardest part wasn't the external threats. It was the internal battle, the struggle to change, to break free from the past. One evening, as the crew gathered for a rare moment of peace, Forrest spoke up. "We're not just fighting the world outside. We're fighting ourselves. Every one of us has something we're still running from, but we can't keep running. We have to face it, head on." The room went quiet as they all looked at him. Forrest wasn't one for long speeches, but when he spoke, they listened. "I've seen what happens when you keep running," Forrest continued, his voice steady. "We've all been running from something for too long, but we can't outrun ourselves. The truth of his words hung in the air, heavy and undeniable. The crew had made their choice to walk away from the streets, but now they had to face the hardest part of their journey, facing who they had been and learning to live with it. No party had always been about survival, always focused on making it through. But as he sat at the table, reviewing the plans for their new business, he realized that survival was no longer enough. It was time for something more. "What are we really fighting for?" No party asked, his voice low, but filled with thought. "We made it out of the game, but what's next? Are we just surviving, or are we building something that lasts?" The question echoed in the silence of the room. They had all fought to survive, but now they had to fight for something more. They had to build something that mattered. "We're not just surviving anymore," No party added, his voice filled with a new sense of purpose. "We're fighting for a future, and that's worth more than all the money and power we ever had." The crew had broken free from the chains of their past, but the fight wasn't over. As they moved forward, each member of the crew faced their own battles, facing their pasts, questioning their futures, and trying to find their place in a world that didn't follow the same rules as the one they had left behind. They weren't perfect. They didn't have all the answers. But they were moving forward, step by step, trusting that they could build something better. The streets had tried to break them, but they had shown that the only way to break free was to keep fighting, for themselves, for their future, and for the life they wanted to build. Weeks turned into months, and the crew found themselves neck-deep in a grind that was nothing like the one they had known. The hustle was still there, but this time it wasn't about bending rules. It was about learning them, mastering them, and flipping the same energy they used in the streets into something legal, something real. The legitimate business was starting to form, slowly but surely. Forrest and Cori had taken the reins on the back end, tightening up the paperwork, figuring out the permits, and keeping the business clean. DG Mula was overseeing branding and strategy, pulling together a vision that would give their company an edge. Tuda and Snoobs handled the logistics, locking down partnerships and making sure inventory moved. King 2 stayed in the studio, channeling his inner chaos into raw music that bled truth. No party moved through the streets with a different energy now, watchful, protective, reminding the block that they were still there, just on different business now. But progress came with pressure. They were being watched by both the ones they left behind and the ones who never wanted to see them rise. The old enemies hadn't forgotten, and the new ones? They were waiting, silently, hoping the crew would slip just enough to fall back into old patterns. One evening, Forrest got the call. "We need to talk," came the voice on the other end. "There's movement. Some old heads think you all are soft now. They're plotting." Forrest didn't flinch. He hung up, stared at the wall for a second, then called a meeting. The crew gathered in the old safe house. The energy was tense, heavy with memories. It wasn't just about business anymore. It was survival again, but this time, they weren't planning a hit or a retaliation. They were protecting what they had built. "We ain't weak," King 2 said, standing. "But we're different now, and that's got them shook. They don't know how to fight people who don't play by the same rules no more." "We still got fire in us," DG Mula added. "But we're not lighting anything up just to prove a point. We move smart now. If they come, we ready, but we ain't going looking for nobody." "Let them talk," Snoop said, his voice cool. "Talking doesn't make moves, and if they do move, we'll handle it." But as they left the meeting, Cori pulled Forrest aside. "You think we really ready for this? I mean, this new life we're building, it's strong, but it's fragile too." Forrest nodded and said, "We ain't ever going to be fully ready, but we're done being scared. We built something real, and we'll die protecting it, just like we used to die protecting corners that never gave a damn about us." The threat didn't come that night or the next, but it lingered in the background like a storm on the horizon. Still, the crew kept pushing. One day, King 2 stood in front of a group of teens at a local community center. Cori had set up the event. It was a mentorship program. Real stories, from real people. No sugarcoating, just truth. King 2 looked out at the kids, eyes wide, half of them already halfway in the game, the other half trying to decide if they should jump in. "I thought I was a king in the streets," he said. "Turns out I was just surviving. Real power, real legacy, that comes from building. not tearing stuff down. They listened. Not all of them, but enough. That night, King 2 sat in his car, staring at the flyer for the next session. For the first time, he felt something different. Purpose. This was bigger than them now. It wasn't just about staying out of the game. It was about helping others avoid the trap altogether. Across town, Forrest looked out over the lot that would soon be the crew's first brick and mortar. A studio, a community space, a store. It was all happening. Slow, painful, but real. They weren't just breaking the cycle anymore. They were replacing it, brick by brick. The slow grind of legit living didn't hit the same as fast money. There were no shortcuts, no payoffs under the table, no intimidation tactics to smooth things over. Just paperwork, patience, and pressure. And that pressure was piling up quick. The crew's new business, Across the Map Entertainment, was legit on paper, but behind the scenes, the ghosts of their past hovered like shadows. Funding was tight, partners were flaky, and the city still saw them as what they used to be, not what they were trying to become. King 2 felt it heavy one afternoon as he walked into a bank for a business loan. Cleaned up, dressed right, spoke with purpose, but the moment they pulled his name, it was like the room changed. "Sorry, we're not able to move forward at this time," the banker said, eyes skimming the screen without ever really seeing him. "There's just too much risk." King 2 clenched his jaw, nodded, and walked out without a word. But inside, that old fire started to burn. The disrespect. The dismissal. Like all the growth meant nothing. He pulled out his phone and called Forrest. "They don't want us to win." "They never did," Forrest replied. "That's why we have to win anyway." Back at the studio space they were renovating, Snoobs and Tuda were dealing with a different issue. A supplier who'd been skimming on materials and blaming it on miscommunication. Tuda was ready to go full old school. "Just say the word," he said, standing toe-to-toe with the man in question. But Snoobs put a hand on his shoulder. "Nah, we don't handle it like that anymore. Let me talk." 5 minutes later, the supplier was gone, and a new one was on the way. "This right here?" Snoobs said to Tuda, "This is the new flex. We don't gotta scare nobody to be respected. We build, and let the results speak." But not everyone had fully transitioned. No party was caught in between. He'd been making music again, dropping verses that cut deep with truth, but he was also back in contact with a few faces from the old block. Not on business, just checking in, as he called it. But Forrest noticed. "You know what you're doing," Forrest told him one night. "You're either in or you're out. You keep playing both sides, and sooner or later, you're gonna get pulled back in." No party didn't respond. Just nodded and walked off. But his silence spoke volumes. Meanwhile, Cori was holding everything together with bare hands and sleepless nights. He was coordinating meetings, dealing with contracts, handling neighborhood pushback, and still finding time to mentor the younger ones they'd brought into the fold. But even anchors crack. Late one night, Forrest found him outside the office, sitting on the hood of his car, staring up at the sky like it held answers. "You good?" Forrest asked. "I don't know," Cori replied honestly. "Every day feels like we're one mistake away from it all falling apart. But it hasn't, yet." Forrest stood next to him. "You always carried all of us. Let us carry you too." The silence between them was a moment of brotherhood. Not just between two men, but between two survivors choosing peace over war, legacy over ego. Then the warning came. A tagged mural on the side of their building. "We ain't forget. Y'all ain't safe." No name, no sign, just a message. The past was knocking. The next night, the crew sat in the studio. "We can't let this throw us off," DG Mula said, "but we can't ignore it either." King 2's eyes were sharp, jaw tight. "Let me handle it." "No," Cori said firmly. "That's what they want, for us to go back, to throw away everything we built." Tuda added, "Let 'em watch, let 'em talk, but they touch anything, we show them we still here. Just different." Snoobs leaned forward. "Then it's settled. We protect what's ours, but we don't let the past write our story." A week later, the studio opened its doors for the first time. Kids from the block came through. Local artists got on the mic. Former enemies stood in the back, quiet but watching. There was music, laughter, vulnerability, and truth. The kind of night that reminded everyone what they were fighting for. King 2 stepped on stage and grabbed the mic. "I used to run this block in a different way. Now I want to build it. We came from war, but we choose peace. That doesn't make us soft, it makes us strong as hell." The room erupted. For that one night, the future felt real. But the crew knew better than to think the battle was over. This was just the beginning. To be continued.